Sony a7IV versus the Sony FX30, which one is right for you? I'm actually going to be selling one of these two cameras at the end of this process, so making this video is helping me decide which one I want to keep, and hopefully it will help you decide which one you want to get in the first place. The a7IV is Sony's sort of entry level into a full frame mirrorless camera. It's very much a photo camera, by which I mean it's like traditional design. It looks like a photography camera, but just like any photo camera nowadays, it's very much a hybrid, meaning that it can obviously take photos, but also shoot really, really good video. This is the a7IV, by the way, and over here, this is the FX30. This is the latest entry into the cinema line from Sony, following in the footsteps of its bigger brother, the FX3. The FX30 is much more video focused. It is a hybrid camera. You can take photos with it, but as we'll kind of get into here in a bit, the photo features on the FX30 are limited, especially in comparison to the a7IV. Another big differentiation between the two is going to be the price. The a7IV in the United States costs about $2,500 body only. The FX30, on the other hand, there are two models that you can get, one with the audio top handle and one without. Without the audio top handle, it's about $1,800, so that's $700 less than the a7IV. So it's considerably less money that you can invest in some other gear for the camera. You can get some SD cards, you can get a CF Express Type A card if you so desire. You can get a lens or maybe even two lenses. So whatever you want to do with that money, or just put it in the bank. FX30 with the audio top handle, which is what I have, costs $2,200. So even that is less expensive, and you get the audio top handle, which gives you some really nice functionality, which I really enjoy. I've been using the audio top handle ever since getting the FX30 to record pretty much all the audio for my YouTube videos. Sony also sells what's called the K3M XLR adapter, which is basically the audio top handle minus the handle portion. And you can put that right on top of the a7IV into the interface shoe, the MI shoe on top of the camera. But that audio interface, K3M, costs $600. So if you add that on top of the a7IV, then you're obviously well north of $3,000 for that combo. This video is going to be focused on the video features of these cameras. I'm going to mention the photography advantages and disadvantages, but I'm not really going to show you really any sample photos or anything like that. The a7IV has a 33 megapixel full frame sensor. The FX30 is a 26 megapixel aps-c sensor. For video, the a7IV is downsampling from about 7K, but the maximum resolution that you can record in camera is 4K. The FX30 is downsampling from around 6K into a 4K file. Number one, it's a full frame sensor as opposed to the FX30, which is a crop sensor or aps-c or Super 35, whatever you want to call it. In my opinion, the image quality, sort of like in a general sense, of the a7IV is better than the FX30. I think it's got more dynamic range. It is a cleaner image. You'll have less noise in the underexposed areas of your scene in general. The low light performance is also quite a bit better on the a7IV than the FX30. It's a much better photography camera. The FX30 has some real limitations. You cannot shoot in high frame rates on the FX30 in photo mode, so there's no burst shooting, no continuous shooting. On the FX30, you just get one shot at a time. There's no mechanical shutter on the FX30, whereas the a7IV, as a kind of traditional photo camera, does have a mechanical shutter. The a7IV has an electronic viewfinder. The FX30 does not have one. For video shooters, I know a lot of people don't really care about EVFs. I like them for a couple reasons. Its LCD screen is not very good. It's not super high resolution. It's also not very bright, and it's easily washed out in bright sunlight conditions. It can be really hard to see it. So having the EVF obviously mitigates that, or helps that out. I also like the EVF because it adds an additional point of contact. So these cameras are really small, really light. They can be kind of jittery if you're trying to do handheld shots. So holding it up to your face gives you another point of stability. And another thing that I like is just having sort of eye level shooting. Sometimes you want to be at that level. We often find ourselves holding these cameras down at the chest or at the waist level because of the LCD screen, the way they fold out or flip out, and you don't always want to be shooting sort of at that low vantage point. It is obviously a much more video-focused, video-centric camera, and it has a lot more features that are devoted to shooting video. Number one, it does have Cine EI mode, and if you don't know what that is, I've made a pretty in-depth video about that that explains what it is, how to use it, and why you would want to use it. If you don't want to watch that video, let me just make one point about Cine EI. It does not alter the image quality or do anything to the image quality of a camera that has Cine EI. So both of these cameras have S-Log3, S-Gamut3, and S-Gamut3.Cine. When you're in Cine EI mode, that's the only color space and gamma that you can choose, but you can choose the same color space and gamma in the A7IV. All Cine EI is a way to monitor and adjust your exposure that you're gonna get in post-production. It doesn't change anything about the image quality. The FX30 has a simplified menu that basically gathers up all of the most used functions for video and puts them on like one and a half pages. So you don't have to go deep diving into the menu to get a lot of the features that you want or a lot of functions that you want as a video shooter. It also moves all of the info off of the image. It just puts them all on the black bars above and below, whereas on the A7IV, a lot of the info might crowd your screen, so that's kind of a nice feature of the FX30 as well. You can also input custom LUTs into the FX30, so if you like to use LUTs to color correct, to color grade your footage, you can use those same LUTs to monitor while you're actually shooting so that what you're looking at or what you're shooting is going to match what you get in the end. With the latest firmware, the FX30 has the ability to shoot in DCI 4K. If you don't know, that's just a slightly wider version of 4K with slightly more resolution on the long end, 4096 versus 3840. However, it doesn't give you any additional field of view on the wide end. It only just crops the top and the bottom, so you're actually losing field of view in DCI 4K. You can also shoot in true 24p, whereas on the A7IV you can shoot in 23.976. They also added in another high frame rate option with this firmware, so you can now shoot in 48 frames per second when you're shooting in that 24 frames per second mode. However, you are going to need a CF Express card to unlock that mode or unlock that feature. The FX30 has much better heat management. It has an internal fan and it's got vents on the side to exhaust hot air. So you'll really not have any reasonable situations where you can expect that camera to overheat. The A7IV, being such a high megapixel sensor that's downsampling into 4K, does generate a lot of heat. You can just feel it as you hold the camera. It does get really hot to the touch. And I can imagine, although it's never happened to me, that you will run into some situations, or you could run into some situations where that camera will overheat. In my opinion, the FX30 is better built. The A7IV is noticeably kind of like a little bit cheaper feeling than the FX30. I think the FX30 is very much just the FX3 body, and there is a difference, I think, between the A7IV and some of the higher end cameras in terms of just the build quality. The A7IV is not bad, but it's not as good. It has more high frame rate options and better quality high frame rate options than the A7IV. Both cameras have breathing compensation that's available with compatible Sony lenses. They both have focused mapping. The FX30 has dual SD card slots and dual CF Express Type A card slots, and the A7IV has dual SD card slots and only one CF Express Type A card slot. However, for video on the A7IV, there's no mode that requires the CF Express card slot. Now that we have a general overview of advantages and disadvantages between these two cameras, let's get into some specific comparisons, starting with rolling shutter and image stability. I like to lump these two together because I think they go hand in hand in determining how usable a camera is going to be as a handheld run-and-gun style camera. At 24 frames per second, the FX30 is noticeably better at rolling shutter. It has less rolling shutter or a faster sensor readout than the A7IV. However, at 4K 60, for some reason, the FX30 becomes a much slower reading sensor, and it seems to be just a little bit worse than the A7IV at that resolution and frame rate. In terms of image stabilization, they both seem very, very similar. There's really not much difference between them. It might be surprising that the FX30's image stabilization isn't better, considering it has a smaller sensor. You would think that there would be more like room to just physically maneuver that sensor in the body to stabilize it, but that doesn't really seem to play out in the real world. They seem very similar. One area that I did notice the A7IV struggle is with the active stabilization in this comparison. I did notice that there's some sort of like juddery motion happening in the background on one of the shots. I never noticed that before, so maybe I took a particularly heavy step and just shocked the sensor. I didn't see that on the FX30, so that would be one slight edge to the FX30, but it's not something that I think you're going to run into all the time. So neither camera is particularly like class leading in terms of image stability, whether that's just in the standard IBIS or in the active. The active does go a long way in making them much smoother as handheld video shooters, whereas with the standard IBIS, they're both really jerky, really bumpy, and I think both cameras could really use some additional equipment to make them heavier, make them a little bit bigger, to make them better at handheld. High frame rates. I mentioned earlier the FX30 has more high frame rate options and better quality. It is a full frame camera, so in 24 and 30 frames per second, you're going to get the full width of the sensor, but at 4K 60, it actually crops in to an aps-c portion of that sensor. So you're going to get the same field of view in 4K 60 on both cameras. I think the image quality between the two in 4K 60 is very, very similar. There's really not much to separate them. The FX30 can shoot 4K 120, whereas the a7IV can shoot in 120, but only in HD, not 4K. The 4K 120 in the FX30 is cropped in even more, so I think it's another 1.5 times crop on top of the already super 35mm crop. So in comparison to full frame, it's kind of like a 3 times crop, which is pretty drastic, but the reason it's doing that is it's cropping into a 3840 by 2160 pixel readout of the sensor. So it's giving you basically a 1-to-1 readout. So it's giving you full 4K, but only at 3840 by 2160. So it's not downsampling from that full 6K. I would imagine that's just for heat management, processing power, et cetera, et cetera. There's always limitations and always compromises when it comes to high frame rates with all of these cameras. The a7IV, in order to do 120, is only giving you HD. Potential benefit of being so cropped in. One reason you might want to shoot in 4K 120 is for a lot of fast action. So that could be sports, that could be wildlife, something like that, in which case you probably can't be right in the action anyway, so you're going to be far away, and having that crop could help you get the reach that you need. Just trying to find the glass half full here. The FX30 can also go all the way up to 240 frames per second in HD, but I don't have any test footage of that. It's kind of similar scenario where the HD quality isn't that good, but if you just for whatever reason need to get a 240 frames per second shot, you can do that on the FX30. I didn't do any specific autofocusing tests. Both have the exact same autofocusing capabilities. In video, they can both do eye tracking for humans, animals, and birds. Birds, I think, are animals, but they separate them between your general animal and your bird animal. They both have the same sort of sensitivity and speed transition settings. In my opinion, they both work really, really well. The a7IV has always been just like rock solid as a video autofocus camera, never had any problems with it. I have had some occasions where the FX30 failed to get focus or maintain focus, but there's a lot of variables. It could have been a lens thing. But I've never had any issues with the a7IV. I've had a 1 or 2 times where the FX30 didn't perform well, but most of the time, like 95% of the time, it's pretty much identical to the a7IV. The a7IV with a bigger sensor does have more autofocus points than the FX30, so I guess potentially it could be better. You know, they're both really, really good. Sony still is sort of class leading in terms of video autofocus, in my opinion. I didn't do any specific battery life tests. They seem really comparable. If you use them in the same way, you'll probably get very similar battery life. At 4K 24, 4K 30, you can easily get 2.5 hours of runtime with these cameras. The FX30, it does have an internal fan. I would imagine if that fan is spinning up because it's really hot and trying to mitigate heat, that's going to drain the battery more. And also if you have the audio handle and you're using it and powering a microphone with phantom power, that's another thing that's going to drain the battery. In 4K 24, 4K 30, where you're using the full width of the sensor, you're getting that 7K downsample into 4K, the a7IV is better. It's got more dynamic range. It's cleaner. I think the exposure is more forgiving to, you have more leeway to retain highlights, to change your exposure a little bit without sacrificing the quality. On the FX30, I think you have to be much more deliberate and much more careful with how you expose the camera to make sure that you're not getting noisy shadows. In well-lit situations, if you're outdoors with a lot of light, the FX30 is going to hold up really well to the a7IV. In situations where there's a lot of contrast, a lot of underexposed areas where you're trying to retain some detail in the shadows and hold the highlights, that's where you're going to see the differences between the two cameras and where the advantages of the a7IV in that full frame sensor come into play. I hope that was helpful. I hope I've been able to give you some information and help you clarify your decision between these two cameras. I know that I've made a decision for myself, but I don't want that decision to sway you either way. I do think that the a7IV would be the right camera for a lot of people, and I'm just not that person. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, you know where they go. And as always, I appreciate you watching the video, and maybe I'll see you in another one.
Griff.